Well, welcome to the second week in this new Nehemiah series. Now, last week I mentioned that there are two R's and two V's that we'll use as sort of lenses as we go through these 13 chapters in Nehemiah. I wonder, can you remember them? It's only a week ago. The first R, can you remember what it was? You remember it? It was responsibility. And I said, in a nutshell, we need to grasp the significance of the situations we find ourselves in. And that is no matter how big or small they may be. You know, this first R, this first letter, responsibility, should be an obvious characteristic of the Christian. Now, what about the second R? Can you remember that? Easy from Nehemiah, really. What's the main theme? It's restoration, isn't it? We need to remember that Jesus came to make all things new. A new kingdom has come, the old is gone, and the new is here. Which leads us quickly on to our second letter, which was V. Can you remember what V was for? V was for vision. And I quoted from Proverbs 29:18. It was the New King, well, it wasn't the New King James, it was the Old King James Version, the Standard King James. Where there is no vision, it says the people perish, and it continues. You know, we need input, don't we? God's input on the things we need to press into. And that leads us to our final V. V was for value. You know, no matter how grubby or chewed up our lives can become, you and I are always still valuable to God. And He's always trying to draw us into that place of a restored relationship with Him. So those are my four lenses, or as you'll see where it's advertising, the subtitle for this series: responsibility, restoration, vision, and value. Now, last week we looked at how Nehemiah prayed about the things that were before him. And actually, as I was preaching in church, I realised there was just 12 words that kind of summed up Nehemiah's prayer into something that you and I can apply today and every day without making things complicated. What did Nehemiah pray? Well, it was something like this: give your servant success today in the things that are before me. Let me repeat that to you. Give your servants success today in the things that are before me. Just a 12-word prayer. How simple is that? You know, this model of praying, you will see that today, is kind of bookending what we're going to look at the end of this message. Because at the end of chapter 2, there in verse 20, Nehemiah answers his critics by applying that prayer that I've just said to you from chapter 1, which was asking if God will grant success, changing it from if to the God of heaven will give us success. That's what you'll see when we get to the end of the message today, from if to will. Now, we will look at chapter 2 in more detail, but let this very simple prayer that we looked at last week in chapter 1 remind us that when we have our eyes fixed upon God, then we don't need to have everything in order and sorted out in our minds so that we can then obviously take that shopping list prayer to God and say, hey, God, can you bless all my great ideas? You know, no, we're released, aren't we? When we pray that kind of prayer, we're released into praying into God's will, the Father's will. Like Jesus said to us, didn't he? If you ask God for the God stuff, which actually demands no planning from us, and we do exactly the God stuff, what God tells us to do, then the God of heaven, the great and awesome God that Nehemiah spoke about last week, who keeps his commandment of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, he will grant us success in the things we do in his name. Now, this is not rocket science, is it? I don't think there's some hugely deep theological truth that we need to grasp here, or some doctrine which is way beyond us. No, this type of praying, again, sits in that realm of relationship, doesn't it? And our obedience to listen carefully and then act completely and faithfully upon what God says, regardless of how we think the things should be or will be successful in our own eyes. You know, most problems come about because we think we know better than God. Now, you might say, no, I'm never like that, Darren. But actually, I think we see that a lot. And certainly in our society, you know, the idea of sacrifice and suffering is not something that's seen as a positive thing. But yet we know as Christians, don't we? I'm sure your journey, when you look back, you'll see through sacrifice and suffering that actually when you've gone through some of those most difficult times, that's when we see God was at work the most. The ultimate example, of course, is Jesus' death on the cross, wasn't it? You know, the enemy of God must have thought, hey, I've done it. I've got the final victory here. But that was wrong. You know, it was in what seemed the most desperate moments for the disciples that they in fact witnessed the most incredible victory. We've got to remember, God's ways are not our ways. So we need to learn to listen and to put our trust and our complete faith in God and God alone. And we're going to see that this morning in more of the details here in Nehemiah 2 this week. Now, nothing in Scripture is a wasted word. There's a good statement for you. And certainly times and dates and genealogies, they are there to serve a purpose. And actually both in Nehemiah 1 and as we'll look at in Nehemiah 2, we have some dates at the beginning. Now, I'm not going to get bogged down with these dates, but actually, just as a little aside, if you hear someone say, well, actually, Nehemiah is all made up because there's actually a discrepancy right in the first two chapters here, in the dates mentioned in chapter 1 and chapter 2. Well, your answer to them, and you can go and look this up if you want to look into this a little bit more, the dates that are actually given to us are carefully written down. But they're actually working from two different calendars. So if anybody's thrown that at you and said Nehemiah's all made up because they've got the dates wrong, actually, you know, they're two different calendars. But what is interesting is in chapter 1 and chapter 2, it says this, chapter 2 and verse 1, it says this right at the beginning. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Now, I know you're sat there going, wow, isn't that amazing? But actually, why is that so important to tell us these dates? Well, this is because it helps us establish the dates that are given to restore Jerusalem and its walls. If you look in Daniel 9:25, it says exactly that. There's some 77s and all the numbers there multiplied up. Exactly, if you work that out, 173,888 days from this day, which has been put down as March the 14th, 445 BC. You know, the Messiah, the Prince, would be presented to Israel. Sir Robert Anderson, he's an eminent British astronomer, great guy, and mathematician. He makes a case that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy exactly to the day by entering Jerusalem on April the 6th, AD 32 AD, whichever way you put it round, which is exactly what we get, precisely 173,880 days from here in Nehemiah 2:1. Now, if you like your dates and your numbers and stuff, that's an interesting aside maybe to look at. But nonetheless, it's another thread that shows God is a God of order and control. He's in control, and his work, he works things out for a reason. And there is so much more going on sometimes than just a wall that's being restored. Now, as we move on in chapter 2, we've already seen in our reading that the king recognizes that Nehemiah is visibly troubled. Now, I don't know if you know, but back in the day, if you served the king, just being in his presence should blow all of your troubles away. And actually to be seen sad around the king could actually result in one of those off with your head kind of moments. So when the king asks Nehemiah, you know, what's up, man? Come on. You know, Nehemiah is very wise in his reply, isn't he? You know, let's look at Nehemiah's nervous or fearful reply, or reverent fear here in verse 3. This is what he says. Nehemiah says, I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? Now, note, Nehemiah didn't say, oh, it's nothing, or I'm fine really, like we tend to do when someone asks how we are. He gives actually quite a guarded reply, which would have hit a note with the king about ancestral ruins and the city gates being burnt with fire. He was a king, wasn't he, of a vast empire, and if such a thing was before him, he would have wanted to put it right. And he actually asked Nehemiah that very question there in verse 4. What did he say? The king says, well, Nehemiah, what is it that you want? Now, we need to remember here that Nehemiah would have known that it was God, from his prayer, wasn't it, who had given him favour or success with the king. And from the dates that we've already been given, we can actually work out that it was about 4 months since Nehemiah had first prayed that prayer that we looked at last week, asking God to grant him success. So here, Nehemiah is recorded as praying to the God of heaven once more. You know, he fires up one of those quick type prayers, that kind of like, help me, but nobody knows that's what you're praying kind of prayer. And again, we see a truthful, but actually a really carefully worded answer here in verse 5. You've got verse 5, Nehemiah 2. Why don't you look it up for yourself? It says this: if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favour in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. You know, it's worth noting at this point that Nehemiah has not mentioned Jerusalem yet, but allowing God the space to work in the king's heart before any prejudices stop things dead in their tracks. As let's be honest, Jerusalem was probably, I don't know, could you call it a bit of thorn in the side of the empire here? But with the queen beside him, it's recorded the king was pleased to send Nehemiah. So Nehemiah set a time. It was as if the king had probably come up with this idea on his own. There's some wisdom at work here and how Nehemiah answered these questions. Now, this is probably where that 4 months of prayer, praying over those things with God, really started to fall into place. I've said it already, God is a God of order and he has plans. And as we said earlier, God will always do what he said he will do. And Nehemiah has clearly worked through some of these things, hasn't he? These plans with God. Let's remember, God knows what's coming up and Nehemiah doesn't. We do because we've read it all, don't we? So we see that God is already making sure Nehemiah has everything that he'll need to be successful, as was his original prayer, wasn't it? So we see here in verses 7 through to 8 that there's a list of things that Nehemiah requested. And actually here we read at the end of verse 8, drop down towards the end of it there. It says, and because, this is Nehemiah saying, because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted me all of my requests. The king granted the requests. And it's worth maybe just pausing here for a moment to consider how you and I are organised when we're actually doing the things that God is calling us to. Are we as organised as this, as we've been praying this stuff through? You know, something actually that came to mind really strongly as I was preparing this was actually that model of planning that's called SMART plans. Now, some of the deacons will probably say, oh yeah, I know about that, other ministry leaders. We've done some of that here in the past at Limbrick Woods. And I think you'd agree, any plan that is a SMART plan hopefully will hold some wisdom. But the SMART I'm talking about is one of those acronyms where each letter is a different but specific part of the plan. And I think if you and I are to be successful in our plans, we need to be smart too. Now I'm going to break this down for us. I think I might have done this once before, but it's worth going back to again because I think there's a lot to learn here. So SMART plans, our first letter in the word SMART is S, of course. And it stands for being specific. Be specific in the things that we are trying to achieve. Now, normally our plans can be too general and also they can be too long-winded. Nehemiah has a very specific plan, doesn't he? Very cleverly worded in verse 5. What did he say? He said, let the king send me, which makes it look like it's his idea, to the city in Judah. Remember I said he's been non-specific for the reasons that we've mentioned already. Where my ancestors are buried. You know, the king sees this as personal to me. Nehemiah probably actually answers why he is sad. And this is the specific ask. Nehemiah says the very next bit there, so that I can rebuild it. There it is. You know, it's a precise and a concise plan without loads of waffle. It's specific. And you and I need to learn to be specific too when seeking what God is calling us to. If we don't have a specific answer from God, maybe there's still things we're chewing over, then like Nehemiah, maybe there are more months of prayer and fasting that are required. I'm going to push through this quite quickly. Our next letter is M. M is for measurable. How will we know if we're reaching our goal? Well, we'll know that if this ties into our other letters here, and this can probably happen at the same time. So we need something that's measurable. So A is our next letter. A is for achievable. Is it actually something we can do, or do we need to go back and sharpen up the specific parts and maybe the measurable parts so that we can see that it's achievable? Now, let me be clear. What I'm telling you here, this is an exercise, not an exercise to see if we can shoehorn maybe one of our great fab ideas into some trendy corporate planning model. No, I think this smart plan or this smart planning is a great tool we can use to measure if we are going to be successful with these things. So the first three stages, this SMA part, might get chewed over a number of times, and only then do we look at the fourth letter, R. And R stands for resources. What are the resources we need? How much cash, what stuff do we need? And finally, our last letter is T, timescale. How long will it take for all this to happen? And again, maybe it is by the time we actually get to the fifth stage, we go, actually, I'm going to have to chew all this over again because it's going to take too long and I need to go back through the other stages. I haven't got enough time to do this. I haven't got enough resources. So the plan needs to change again. You see, my point here is when the smart plan works out on paper, only then is it a good time to carry out the plan. And actually, I think Nehemiah 2, what we see here is probably a perfect smart plan. I don't imagine that it took 4 months of just God saying, here, this is it, right at the beginning of 4 months, get on with it. I can imagine there was some chewing over. Lord, show me some research, some more conversations, going back and chewing these things over. And here we have in Nehemiah 2 a very specific plan. As we've seen and heard about, God knows what needs to happen and when. It's quantifiable, it's measurable, it's achievable. And with God on his side and the resources that we've seen that have been given by the king already and the timescales that are set in place, it's almost as if the whole plan is proved that it will work before it's even been started. Now, of course, we know the whole narrative of Nehemiah, don't we? And all the twists and turns that come along. But there is one really important thing that needs to happen with a smart plan. I wonder, can you think what is the main thing now that needs to happen with a smart plan? Well, the answer is given to us. The answer to that question is given to us. It's those first two words there in verse 11. Verse 11, what does it say? It says that this plan that we've got, it needs to turn into an action plan. What does verse 11 tell us? It says, Nehemiah went. He went to Jerusalem. It's about 800 miles from Persia to start rebuilding those walls. You see, any plan is totally ineffective until it's carried out. What I skipped over a moment ago was, of course, verse 10. And we see what happens when we step out for God or we start to take action with a plan. You know it. It's probably happened to you, of course. The critics and the negative and the naysayers, even those physical things against us, start to rise up, don't they? Now, I want you to think back to some of the things you felt God was calling you to in the past, but actually they never got off the ground because you never actually started them. They were great ideas, and while there was a lot of talk about what you might do, the actual doing part never became a reality. I think it's all too easy for the Christian to talk about doing something. We can even pray about something. We can plan it and so on. But it's a whole different thing to actually do it. And of course, in the spiritual realms, there are our spiritual enemies that don't mind us planning. Let's be very clear on this. They don't mind us planning things all day long as all we're doing is planning and praying and talking about it, but not doing it. The moment we start doing something, hey, that's when we get their attention, isn't it? Again, there's another lesson here from Nehemiah 2 for us today. Just like Nehemiah was specific, but actually not too specific about which city he was going to with the king. Look at verse 12. It's recorded to us this, doesn't it? When Nehemiah arrived there in Jerusalem. It says, Nehemiah set out during the night with a few others. He had not told anyone what God had put in his heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no mounts with him except the one he was riding on. You know, the lesson here is that there's a right time to reveal your whole plans to people. It is without a doubt, everyone would have seen Nehemiah arriving, huge military escort there, materials, it all arrives in Jerusalem. But actually it's recorded that Nehemiah did nothing for 3 days. And sometimes for you and I, there is a plan, but not everyone needs to know everything. Especially if there are some Sanballats, Tobias and Geshems that are actually around, whose goal actually is only to upset us, as we could see there back in verse 10. So we see in verses 12 through to 16, Nehemiah sets out, if you want some geography, sets out on the west side of Jerusalem, turns left and goes in that counterclockwise direction around the city walls. And it's recorded there in verse 13 and 15 that he viewed the walls. And it's quite interesting when we look at words. The word viewed, that Hebrew word viewed, is not used that often. It's actually quite a primitive word, meaning to scrutinize. It says by the implication of watching, to expect with hope and patience. It's actually quite a good word, isn't it, for what's coming up next for Nehemiah. And as this chapter, I think, starts to come to a close, we can see more of the wisdom that Nehemiah has again when he's meeting with the leaders of Jerusalem. We see it in verses 17 through to 18. Nehemiah does something quite important here. He actually steps personally into the situation, doesn't he? He says to them, "See the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates burn with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall, and we will no longer be in disgrace." It's worth pointing out here that many others had tried unsuccessfully to rebuild the walls over the previous 100 years. So what is going to be different here about Nehemiah? What does it say in verse 18? Let's have a look at that together. Verse 18, Nehemiah 2. Nehemiah said, "I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, 'Let us start rebuilding.' So they began this good work." So, a quick application of our 4 lenses here. We see both the king and the leaders in Jerusalem, along with Nehemiah, taking responsibility for the rebuilding work. They're also caught up now in the vision for rebuilding, for differing reasons, no doubt, but nonetheless, whichever direction they approached this situation from, the vision was clear. There was a smart plan, and with the authority Nehemiah had from both the king and God himself, they saw that their work would be honoured and it would be restored. They are no longer living as outcasts with shame. God was restoring something else, wasn't he? He's restoring their value. They had value to God, and God was now going to help them do something about it. Now, of course, let's enter the opposition again in verse 19, that theatrical dun 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 kind of moment. What does it actually say there? Well, let's actually read in verse 19, Nehemiah 2 again, verse 19. It says this, "But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, and Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. 'What is this you are doing?' they asked. 'Are you rebelling against the king?'" Now, I wonder, what would your answer be in that moment? Well, this is where I said there is that kind of bookend prayer wisdom bit that plays out. Nehemiah knew that these 3 were actually asking a loaded question. And of course, they could in fact say, "Oh, well, the letter, it's a fake from the king," or they'd come up with some other nonsense. But remember, they are fellow Jews. And they would have been attending the temple, which of course was already built. But Nehemiah here, he wants to focus his attention back on God himself. Their issue here was with God. And if they were not obeying God, then there was a heart issue. There was a heart issue. There was a heart problem. They were not being his servants. And therefore, they would have no share in Jerusalem or claim or historic rights, as it says. And this is where the chapter ends. So what is the takeaway for us? You know, we need to commit ourselves, don't we, to God's plans. I think we need to be smart in our planning. Now, whether you do that or not, that's up to you. But not everybody, remember, needs to know all the details right at the start. And that there is actually a right time to reveal all. We see this here in Nehemiah 2. And actually the key takeaway here, I think for us as well, is that opposition will always come. But we must not put the work to death or stop it or anything else. The doing part must keep going on. We must hold on and deal with our Sanballats and Tobiahs and Geshems, you know, but be clear, our enemies, those that want to stop us, don't deserve our attention. If we give in to them, then they have already won, haven't they? We need to keep our eyes fixed upon God and his plans. Let me close with a piece of scripture from Romans 8:31. Kind of answers that question I've maybe thrown up at the end. What then shall we say in response to these things? Hopefully you know this well. If God is for us, who can be against us? I look forward to unpacking more of this for you over the coming weeks. God bless you.